Welcome to the third in a series of COVID-19 recovery modules. This multi-module series will expand our existing COVID-19 toolkit available on the website maintained by the Leading Ed Partnerships and the Illinois State University Center for the Study of Education Policy. This content is being recorded so that our lead project enrolled principals and principal coaches may access it on demand at a time convenient to them. The content has been open sourced so that school leaders everywhere may benefit. Let's take a look at our learning objectives for today's session. We are going to recognize the interrelatedness of social emotional learning and equity as we enter into Module 3 using SEL as an academic and cultural accelerator. We'll identify SEL priority standards for students. And we'll consider the relationship between SEL standards and culturally responsive standards as we examine the teaching and leading for educators, for all educators in Illinois, as content for adult learning. We'll name healthy strategies for maintaining well-being. We'll observe for the presence of SEL and equity principles in classroom instruction. And we'll mine high-quality resources and subject matter experts from a resource list provided. The COVID-19 recovery phase module toolkit number 3 is very well aligned to the ISB strategic plan priorities. And those that we've highlighted for you here are that we will support schools to create safe and healthy learning environments for every student. We'll support schools to address the social emotional needs of students, educators, and staff. And we'll support schools to adopt and implement inclusive policies and practices. Let's meet our facilitators. Derek Carr is currently the Director of Professional Development for ROE 28, representing Bureau, Henry, and Stark counties. She's a former middle and high school English teacher who's a well-known statewide expert in continuous school improvement planning. Dara is an ROE capacity builder who's been working with ISB to create materials and processes that provide concrete ways for districts to consider the adoption and implementation of the Illinois Priority Learning Standards. If her voice sounds familiar, it may be that you will have heard her give presentations recorded and posted to the Learning Standards page hosted by ISB. Alicia Haller is the Executive Co-Director of the LEAD Projects, a role she shares with Dr. Erica Hunt. In her role, Alicia oversees a massive multi-year formal research study funded by the U.S. Department of Education involving approximately 140 schools and more than 50 districts across the state of Illinois, located in ROE regions 1, 17, 19, and 28, as well as a cohort of school affiliates of the Greeley Center for Catholic Education at Loyola University. She has extensive experience in principal preparation and development, leadership coaching, and is a well-known thought expert in these areas in the state of Illinois and nationally. While we'll not hear from Alicia during this particular module, Alicia has been very instrumental in bringing this content to our listening audience. Dr. Allison Slade has served as a teacher, professional developer, consultant, and educational leader in the city of Chicago and in the suburbs. After founding Namaste Charter School, she served as a principal for more than 14 years. She presently works as a consultant for the Chicago Public Education Fund as a principal coach for the school leaders serving as professional learning community leaders across the city. Allison teaches at Roosevelt University in a teacher preparation program for bilingual education and was recently elected to serve on her local school board. The voice that you're hearing now is that of Linda Shea. I am the professional learning designer for the Leading Ed Partnerships team at Illinois State University Center's Center for the Study of Education Policy. As stated earlier, the COVID-19 Recovery Phase Toolkit is a multi-part series. Module 1, released in June of 2021, was focused on the smart investment of ESSER 3 funds on research-supported high-leverage practices that are likely to reduce learning opportunity gaps across student groups especially student groups that have been most negatively impacted by the COVID-19 disruption. Module 2, released in July, focused on unfinished teaching as opposed to unfinished learning. And during this session, we offered principles of process for engaging teachers in a thorough review of the Illinois Priority Learning Standards, the assessment blueprints, and evidence tables to locally determine priority standards that respond to any learning gaps that may exist as students proceed through the grade bands. In session 3, our attention turns to social emotional learning and competence for both adults and children. We will explore the SEL standards and competency clusters. Remember to visit the COVID-19 resources on the Leading Ed Partnerships or the ISU Center for the Study of Education Policy websites. A final foundational element is the recognition that some of our source material will come from the well-known Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, also known as CASEL. They are a national thought leader in this area. CASEL cooperated with the National Equity Center to embed equity principles into the SEL competency clusters. And on completion of this module, we hope that you'll come to appreciate the interrelatedness of SEL and equity leadership and just how integrated these two areas actually are. I'm going to toss the program over to Allison Slade, who will help us to set the tone for the module that you're about to appreciate. Allison?
Thanks, Linda. As we think about returning to school in a post-COVID or continuing COVID environment, we think about the regular teacher stress on top of all of the stress that is typically observed and felt by teachers. In the next slide, we look at some of those indicators. During the worldwide pandemic, everyone experienced some form of trauma. We all dealt with a difficult situation, although not all of us were affected in the same way or to the same degree. We have all been through the same storm, but we all did not weather the storm in the same way. As Gloria Ladson-Billings stated, some of us navigated it on an ocean liner, while others of us had only a piece of driftwood to hold on to. Since everyone experienced some form of trauma, this includes children, but also teachers, parents, custodial staff, bus monitors, etc., all of the individuals and stakeholders in a school community. Kids were missing academics, but also other basic human connection. The weight of everyday stressors have been exacerbated by the additional burden of COVID. And the challenge for leadership is that teachers need a space to relieve the stress that they carry, both that typical stress and the additional stress that comes with dealing with returning to school from COVID environment. Additionally, we simply do not know who is in a fragile state and who is not. During the school disruption brought about by COVID, some students dropped out. Whether they cease to attend or engage, we need to recover them now. To do this, we will have to recreate truly welcoming schools and classrooms. In this webinar, we'll be covering many topics such as these and focus on ways to resist the temptation to simply use our ESSER funds to purchase a program and focus instead on continuing to develop humans, both teachers and students. Next, we will move on to our new learning. More than 2 decades of research demonstrates that education promoting social and emotional learning, often known as SEL, gets results. The findings come from multiple fields and sources, including student achievement, neuroscience, health, employment, psychology, classroom management, learning theory, economics, and the prevention of youth problem behaviors. SEL programming can have a positive impact up to 18 years later on academics, social conduct problems, emotional distress, and drug use. There are statistically significant associations between SEL skills in kindergarten and key outcomes for young adult years later. SEL decreased the likelihood of living in or being on a waiting list for public housing, receiving public assistance, having any involvement with police before adulthood, and even spending time in a detention facility. Also, 6 of the top 10 skills identified by the World Economic Forum involve social and emotional competence. In another survey, 92% of surveyed executives say skills such as problem solving and communicating clearly are equal to or more important than technical skills. Companies such as Allstate, Bank of America, and Google are prioritizing SEL. This is evident in the ranking of the World Economic Forum's released top 10 skills for 2025, which list analytic thinking and innovation, active learning and listening strategies as their top skills. Another skill cluster that didn't make the previous list debuted at number 5, skills like resilience, stress tolerance, and flexibility. It's not hard to trace back the need to be innovative, to learn fast, and tolerate stress back to COVID-19. In this year of the pivot, business organizers have been called on to do all of these things. The pandemic lockdowns and economic losses that have accompanied it are combining with the global trend toward automation to create double disruption. The pace of technology adoption expected to remain unabated and may accelerate in some areas, including the use of robots and artificial intelligence in some businesses. This all makes SEL and the development of these skills that we need to develop for our work environment even more important in the return to learn environment. As stated on this slide, we prioritize SEL for all of these reasons. So, what does SEL include that we are going to talk about today? During this webinar, we will address 3 distinct pieces of the social emotional learning puzzle in schools. In the return to in-person learning, each of these pie pieces will play a critical role in ensuring student success in the classroom and lead to accelerated learning, which we discussed in Module 2. We will start today by discussing student SEL. We will move on to discussing the whole school climate and culture, and we will complete our conversation with addressing adult well-being. Just as other academic subject areas experienced a delay in teaching during the pandemic, resulting in unfinished teaching, SEL also suffered on a few fronts. First, teachers did not have enough time to address SEL in the shortened time that they had, either in in-person or remote learning settings. Additionally, students were not coming into regular contact with other children or adults for up to 18 months in a row, as even if they were in person, they were often 6 feet apart at all times, which resulted in a significant decrease in practice time in real-world settings for these students. Concurrently, students and adults experienced additional social and emotional needs, anxiety, depression, and lack of connection to others. Subsequently, there is a significant amount of unfinished teaching in the realm of SEL as we enter the 21-22 school year. This is about unfinished teaching and practice. As a reminder, you get better at everything, practicing piano, reading, and social skills by practicing. COVID has impacted our ability to be social and therefore impacted our time in being social and practicing those skills. As Linda mentioned in our introduction, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, or CASEL, developed the inner circle around SEL more than 15 years ago. These 5 competencies, self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness, are those skills that students and teachers need to continually develop in order to be socially and emotionally competent in schools. CASEL recently updated their framework to acknowledge and incorporate school-wide policies and practices and families and community partnerships, as shown here by the outside rings. Social and emotional learning enhances students' capacity to integrate skills, attitudes, and behaviors to deal effectively and ethically with daily tasks and challenges. Like many similar frameworks, CASEL's integrated framework promotes intrapersonal, interpersonal, and cognitive competence. While this CASEL wheel tells us the what, we will focus our work today in this webinar on the how. As a reminder, in the previous COVID-19 Toolkit modules, we utilized the CASEL framework and competencies to develop a list of corresponding skills that can be taught, practiced, and observed in adults. On the screen here, we have a tool that was made available in this toolkit as well as a springboard for teacher assessment and planning purposes for school leaders. Teachers must be able to self-assess, and leaders need to continually develop these SEL skills in adults so that they can accurately and appropriately identify and develop them in students. Additionally, we have included this tool along with an additional tool from CASEL that can be used as a self-assessment for adults for these purposes as well. Another tool we've provided is the same CASEL competencies, the what of what we need to teach and practice, with an alignment to the Illinois performance descriptors for K through 5 and 6 through 12 for students. This will help leaders identify those skills that teachers should be using and teaching on a daily basis for their students, and ensuring that there is both balance and universal coverage of the entire spectrum of these skills. You will find the complete table of these performance descriptors and aligned skills to the CASEL competencies in the toolkit provided by the Leading Ed Partnerships in this module. Next, I'm going to throw it over to Dara, who is going to delve deeper into our next section.
Only a well-regulated adult can help students to self-regulate. We must first take care of ourselves so that we can take care of students. This philosophy is seen when flight attendants demonstrate how to use oxygen mask for self before placing one on our children. Teachers who possess strong social and emotional competencies are more likely to stay in the classroom longer because they are able to partner more effectively with students and address challenging behaviors, one of the main causes of burnout. According to research, teachers report that they want a greater focus placed on SEL in schools and that they spend more time teaching SEL skills than they did even 5 years ago. So there is a high level of support for this work in our schools. The Illinois Priority Learning Standards were released in August of 2020 to help teachers focus on the most essential or priority standards. These standards were identified by K through 12 educators and subject matter experts. The Illinois Priority Learning Standards acknowledge the importance of social and emotional learning. Just as SEL is focusing on promoting self-well-being, so too do the Illinois PE and health standards. There is a great integration and alignment of the SEL and PE standards as presented in the Illinois Priority Learning Standards document provided by the Illinois State Board of Education. After careful review of the SEL standards, the Illinois Priority Learning Standards Committee determined that all of the SEL standards are of critical importance for each student to grow and develop. It is also firmly believed that SEL standards need to be embedded in every content area as they apply, so that students will find relevant and meaningful application to real-world situations. The Illinois Learning Priority Standards Committee took into consideration that schools and districts are at different stages of implementing the SEL standards within content areas. Given that so many Illinois students were in a remote learning environment beginning in March of 2020 for at least 2 to 3 months, and even for a year in some cases, the Illinois Priority Learning Standards team felt that the topic of safety and social emotional learning was of the highest priority. Students, parents, and school staff need to feel both physically, emotionally safe as we resume to any form of in-person learning. All of the SEL standards will need to be addressed throughout the course of the year. However, schools and districts are to consider how they can create a welcoming return to school environment that promotes student safety and assures them that they are ready to learn. Because physical activity and health instruction have been shown to promote student well-being, students' physical and emotional health together benefit our students and are aligned in the priority standards. Given the fact that SEL standards should continue to be embedded in every content area and included in the most relevant units of study, the Illinois Priority Learning Standards team recommended that the order of the SEL goals be reversed. And in prioritizing these goals, they are prioritized from goal 3 to goal 1. This prioritization greatly aligned to the PE standards, which also focus on one's well-being and healthy life choices. When asked, many school districts rely on SEL published-based or packaged curriculum. However, just as in academic subject areas, curriculum alone is not sufficient to ensure that SEL skills are taught, practiced, and applied regularly across the school setting and in family and community life. A simple "we do" second step will not address the full scope of concern in the return to in-person learning full-time. Before school districts choose an intervention or social emotional learning program, they should assess the needs of their students and staff. Surveys can provide detailed information on student mindsets and a sense of belonging, as well as the level of safety experienced by stakeholders and the overall health of the school climate. Castle does have program recommendations worth reviewing. While programs can help to meet basic knowledge and some skill needs, implementing a program alone is insufficient to establishing and maintaining a culture in which social emotional learning is at the heart of everything we do. Using ESSER funds to purchase a curriculum is a beginning, but certainly not an end. Consider the opportunities for fully integrating social emotional learning throughout the curriculum to establish and maintain ways of being in a school. If SEL is challenging to teach when times are normal, we can only anticipate that the challenges associated with the return to in-person learning will also result in significantly greater challenges for teachers. This slide addresses that concern. Imagine if you are a part of a herd, you won't be heard. Curriculum purchase means herding. What other ways do we have to collect data directly from our students? Surveys are an initial way to gain widespread data. What are traditional ways to collect data? How can we hear our students? This image again displays the concept. If you are a part of the herd, you won't be heard. Suggests that herding students through a common curriculum will not be as responsive to their needs as if we actually hear from them. We need to listen to our students. What are some ways that we might hear directly from students? How can we collect data and information directly from our students? Again, surveys is a great collection data piece and allows us to collect information from a large cross-section of respondents. We discovered the Utah State Survey collection that can be administered to both students and teachers. This survey will be a part of our resources. In this survey, students respond to items addressing particular social and emotional topics, and then teachers provide their perceptions on the same topic. Comparing responses from both by students with responses offered by teachers can help principals and their instructional leadership teams to begin to identify gaps in understanding between what teachers perceive and what it is that students report they actually need. While surveys are a fine source, they are not the other data source. We ask, what are additional ways to collect data and information from our students in order for us to learn more about what they actually need to be successfully, both academically and socially? We can conduct focus groups and student interviews as another way to collect data to support our decision-making process. In the following slides, you will learn about additional ways to engage students in a dialogue about social and emotional wellness. ISB created a return to learn in-person learning document in the spring of 2021. In this document, several strategies were highlighted that will help connect students with an established solid foundation from which staff members at all levels can help students achieve their full potential, both academically and socially emotionally. The first strategy is the check and connect strategy. In this strategy, you assign a specific staff member to check and connect with the students as they return to in-person learning. Teachers, paraprofessionals, office staff, and etc. can be used to make personal connections with students. When students see a caring adult with a smiling face that greets them by name each day, will help the students to start each day with a positive note. We can refine check-in and check-out procedures to help students transition to in-person learning. Many schools have already have procedures in place for this, but they can be revised to meet the needs of students as we transition back to in-person learning, and for those who are having a tough time for this transitional process. It's easy to locate quick check and connect resources to use with students. We will provide additional resources for the strategy in our resource package that goes along with this webinar. A second strategy is the advisory period for middle and high school. By providing an advisory period at any given time each day to students, provides a structured routine from which they can receive resources and support. Consider developing a calendar that will target specific areas of need for your grade levels and student populations. For example, high school advisory periods can focus on SEL, college and career readiness, or SAT prep. Elementary advisory sessions could be more tailored towards specific interventions, SEL, behavioral needs, and etc. Regardless of the grade levels, schools might find it at an advantage to tie these focused supports to their school improvement goals. The last strategy is known as morning meetings and is more prevalent at the elementary school level. Morning meetings create a sense of community and belonging by providing consistently to students. A daily morning meeting helps establish routines into the student day, provides a positive experience first thing in the morning, and builds empathy in school culture. Consider staging morning meetings when possible so school support personnel such as social workers and counselors are available. Assign staff creativity to making morning meeting groups smaller and more personal. Additional morning meeting resources will be available again in the resource document tied to this webinar. Additionally, our resources will provide you with a description of a relationship mapping strategy published by the Making Caring Common project of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. This activity can be conducted to collect data and information about how well connected students are to caring adults in the school setting. With a set of index cards and an inexpensive set of colored adhesive dots, you can produce a data display that will reveal how many and which students have formed positive relationships with adults, and which students are unaffiliated or have negative relationships with adults. This data becomes actionable when the faculty and staff commit to enact a plan that meaningfully connects each student to a caring adult or a compassionate advocate at school. If space and confidentiality are an issue, this exercise can be recreated as a virtual activity with similar impact and results. We will include the activity instructions for both the in-person and virtual delivery in our Module 3 resources. All 3 rounds of COVID relief funding have emphasized student mental health needs as a priority for schools. A comprehensive system for monitoring student well-being should help educators support students in schools and classrooms and allowed for tiered referrals for special services. Many validated instruments on social emotional well-being, learning conditions, and non-academic measures are available to schools at districts at no financial cost. Well-being assessments are only effective when they are a part of a larger strategy for supporting students. Risk behavior assessments can be another potential use of data. We encourage schools to think about these needs when planning for funding using ESSER 3 funds. Having a time set to teach the SEL standards alone is not the answer. This is because SEL is a process of children and youth acquiring and applying the knowledge and skills and attitudes to developing healthy self-identities, managing emotions and achieving personal and collective goals, feeling and showing empathy for others, establishing and maintaining supportive relationships, and making responsible and caring decisions. To help students acquire and apply these vital life skills, SEL will need to live in every place and space throughout a school and cannot be confined to a 30 or 60-minute period of instruction. What would one actually see in a school that is prioritizing SEL? As you can see from this list published by Castle, explicit SEL instruction is just one of many activities along a continuum of actions that schools might take to support students to acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes associated with SEL competency. These 10 indicators are certainly not a checklist or a to-do list, but a list that illustrates that SEL in isolation is not as powerful as SEL infused throughout the school day across content areas, in the way we think about student discipline, in the way we engage with parents and families, in the way we partner with community services providers, and in the work we do in teacher development and professional learning. I will now turn this back to Allison as she continues to focus on additional SEL resources.
Thanks, Dara. We are now going to move into, now that we've covered SEL for students, we are going to move into addressing the learning environment while moving student learning forward through looking at school culture and school climate. We hear these terms used all of the time, and while related, they are not interchangeable. It is important as principals to deliberately use school climate levers to create a culture of inclusion and being heard for all constituencies. Just as teachers do this for students, principals and other school leaders must do this for teachers. As has been discussed, adults and students both may have experienced isolation during this period of school disruption. As a result, our socialization skills may be less polished from lack of use. This is certain to be true for students whose instructional experience will have been significantly altered because of the need to prioritize health and safety, which makes the continuation of developing school culture through continuous school climate development even more critical. This next slide looks at the difference very specifically between school climate and school culture. Understanding the similarities and differences between culture and climate gives us a more precise language to discuss school improvement and a more precise set of strategies and measures to actually improve them. For example, to implement a strategy designed to change our mood or climate is certainly not the same as one that targets our values. School climate, listed here on the left, is a term that has been used for many decades. Its early use denoted the ethos or spirit of an organization. More recently, school climate is thought to represent the attitude of an organization. The collective mood or morale of a group has become a topic of concern, especially in our new age of accountability. It seems that a happy teacher is considered a better teacher, and this attitude influences the quality of instruction in the moment. If happy people truly perform better, then leaders must create conditions in which happiness thrives. Unfortunately, some school leaders do not research the most effective strategies for creating a happy school climate, instead relying on extrinsic rewards. Bringing donuts to the faculty lounge on Friday may help a few teachers wake up quicker, but this act will not affect the full morale of a building. Whenever a group of people spend a significant amount of time together, they develop a common set of expectations, or a culture, what is described on the right. These expectations evolved into unwritten rules to which group members conform in order to remain in good standing with their colleagues. Groups develop a common culture in order to pass on information to the next generation. That information, however, represents a set of beliefs that have been passed down by imperfect humans with personal preferences. In their Attempt to be empathetic, some principals may have adopted a no meeting policy in an effort to unburden teachers. As we learned in the previous module, this departure from routines actually made feelings of detachment more acute and the sense of personal efficacy more evasive. So, while principals may have assumed that if they were not hearing from teachers, they must be supporting each other, that may not have been the case. Developing culture through repeated and deliberate leadership actions is critical, even more in the return to school time. The question, can we count on others when we are struggling in the classroom, is what really matters for overall culture development that impacts student performance. As you can see on the next slide, it is much easier to change an organization's attitude or climate than it is to change its personality or culture. We cannot stop at the attitude. And often this is what we see from school leaders who feel as though their actions are not making an impact on culture data, which we will discuss later in this module. It is important to know the mood of the group, but the personality of the school must be one of problem solving and concern rather than complaints. Here, you can see some ways to help yourself as a school leader differentiate between these important concepts and move to a focus on school culture in the future. Although climate can be thought of as a leading indicator, culture is where the principal really needs to focus on building his or her key leadership actions. Team building activities alone will not result in a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and caring. In the seminal piece by Deal and Peterson, Shaping School Culture, the Heart of Leadership, the authors provide 4 concrete leadership actions that every principal can use to bring healthy cultural aspects and attributes into existence. You can see them here. Teach. Help teachers understand the importance of culture to the improvement of student learning, making regular connections between student learning and prior instruction. E, engage. Engage teachers during staff meetings, professional development, evaluation, team meetings, mentoring, observations. A, affirm or reinforce. Privately and as appropriate, publicly praise, cheerlead, and reward and reinforce evidence of cultural attributes that focus on improved teaching and learning. M, model. Model cultural attributes that you want to promote with respect to your own leadership practice by engaging in inquiry to examine school-wide issues that require attention. Notice that the first letter of each of the 4 strategies, teach, engage, affirm, and model, spells team, making the leadership actions easy to remember. Remember, as a principal, you need to shield teachers from external noise, which there is a lot of lately. While there may be a debate about masking or not masking, which may or may not align with your own position as a parent or community member, it is important for principals to convey a sense of confidence and calm, especially in our highly divided political environment. Teachers want principal reassurances that we will make our school the safest environment that is possible to provide to our students. Some of these decisions are being made at the district or school board level, who are not immune to community pressure. While the public debate may be noisy, it need not become a distraction from the core work of a school. Creating and maintaining a school culture requires effort, Principals must also work to preserve the culture from these potential attacks. So, what is the current focus of you as a principal? What do principal communications and actions reveal about your current commitment to SEL, positive culture building, and equity? The 5 Essentials survey data collects and organizes the thoughts, feelings of students, teachers, and parents by asking them how they experience the way the school operates and does business, social, emotional, and academic, what we've been discussing today. The Illinois 5 Essentials survey is a research-based instrument that provides high-quality data to help us better understand schools as learning organizations. The 15 to 30-minute survey gives voice to stakeholders, including students, teachers, and parents. Then, the Illinois State Report Card makes the data public. The 5 Essentials survey asks questions about 5 essential areas that must be well developed to improve teaching and learning, and all impact that culture that we were just discussing. Ambitious instruction covers mostly student measures. Effective leaders is all designed questions for teachers. Collaborative teachers is also an area where teachers weigh in. Involved families is mostly determined by teacher measures in their perceptions of family engagement. And the supportive environment is mostly covered by questions directly to students. These survey results provide drilled down performance data on each of these essential measures. There are approximately 120 questions that roll into 22 different measures that are then aggregated into these 5 essentials. These measures reliably predict school success. Results are then color-coded so that school leaders may quickly identify strengths and weaknesses. You can see here that the supportive environment is in red, therefore denoting that it needs the most focus of a school leader. 100% of these supportive environment sections is completed by students. So there may be a different perception by those teachers. Listening to the students through use of this 5 Essentials data helps provide them voice in their school environment. If these data do not reflect your perception of your school culture, it may be time to ask, are we really promoting the collaborative, interdependent, teacher, team-focused work focused on improving teaching and learning? And is it resulting in students feeling more welcomed in their school culture? As we discussed, the 5 Essentials survey is perception data that is statistically reliable, research validated, and provides schools with a diagnostic report that can be used in the school improvement process. Like here, it shows that it provides an X-ray of your school that allows school leaders to take into consideration a stakeholder perspectives on school academic and social and emotional learning progress. However, it can also be a lagging indicator for school leaders, as it often doesn't come until the beginning of a new school year. So especially for those leaders who are new to their building, they will want to look at additional data sources to be more contemporary and in the moment with their staff. Therefore, we have provided one additional way to identify your priorities as a school leader to prioritize the creation of that healthy school culture. School culture requires consistent care. So even if you did receive your school 5 Essentials data and you are at the same school, if you have a brand new staff or lots of new members of the staff, you may want to continually create a school culture triage survey where you are looking at the current needs of your students groups and your staff? Do you simply monitor and maintain, or are you headed for the need for intensive care? This tool, along with others that we have provided in our toolkit, may be used immediately by school leaders to prioritize the ongoing development of a culture that is healthy and productive for both students and staff. Both the 5 essentials and this other type of triage survey can provide data that can help address equity. Educational equity is an individual and collective conviction to continuously improve academic, social, and emotional outcomes for all children. Equity work requires critical analysis of our current practices and beliefs around the conditions we create in our learning systems. It goes beyond creating equal conditions within the system, instead focusing on meeting the needs of each student. Doing so requires removing barriers that some students may face in their pursuit of a free, appropriate education. The goal of equitable practice is to ensure common educational outcomes for all students, especially historically marginalized student groups, regardless of gender, gender identity, race, ethnicity, home language, perceived ability, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status. I will now turn it over to Linda to delve deeper into how equity and culture are connected.
Thank you so much, Allison. In this segment of our module, we're going to turn to the question as to what culturally proficient practice means and what culturally responsive practice might mean. And so in the same way that Allison helped us to recognize the difference between culture and climate, and that Dara helped us to recognize that programs alone are insufficient responses to develop social emotional dispositions and competence in students, in this section, we'll elaborate on the equitable dimensions of our leadership practice. And you will notice that there are many terms in use, terms such as cultural competence, cultural proficiency, culturally responsive, culturally sustaining. And while we won't answer all of those, we will explore some in the space of a culturally proficient continuum. I'd like to take a moment and define these categorizations from left to right for you. We turn to the research of Randall and Dolores Lindsay, Kikanza Kikinori Robbins, and Raymond Terrell, whose research provides us this cultural proficiency curriculum, or continuum, and rubric that can be helpful in assessing for the traits of diversity, equity, inclusion as individual attributes of an overall school culture. So let's take a look at these categorizations briefly. Cultural destructiveness can be thought of as the elimination of other people's cultures. We see the difference, we stomp it out. Cultural incapacity can be thought of as a belief that your culture is superior to that of others. This is disempowering to individuals whose membership is of a culture other than your own. We see the difference here and we make it wrong. Cultural blindness is acting as if the cultural differences you see do not matter, or not recognizing that there are differences among and between cultures. Cultural blindness is seeing the difference but acting like you don't. Cultural precompetence is actually seeing the difference and responding inadequately. It's an awareness of the limitations of one's skills or an organization's practices when interacting with other cultural groups. Cultural competence is seeing the difference and understanding the difference that difference makes. Interacting with other cultural groups using essential elements of cultural proficiency helps us to tune our individual behavior and school practices. And finally, the rightmost element along the continuum is cultural proficiency, in which we see difference and we respond positively and affirmingly to that difference. We esteem culture. We know how to learn about individual and organizational culture, and we interact effectively in a variety of cultural environments. We'll return to this content in a moment. But right now, let's take a look at a real life issue to which we may apply this cultural proficiency continuum. Meet Simone Ashley Manuel, an Olympic swimmer for the United States. Swimming caps designed by a UK-based company specifically for Black swimmers with longer, thicker, and fuller hair were recently banned for use in the Tokyo Olympics. Perhaps you heard. They're slightly larger than other swim caps to accommodate dreadlocks, afros, weaves, hair extensions, braids, and thick and curly natural hair. The sole caps, produced by a Black-owned business, were deemed unsuitable by the International Swimming Federation. To appreciate the impact of this decision on a Black athlete, it's important to understand that natural Black hair can be dry because it has fewer cell layers than Caucasian hair, for example. Chlorine, often used as a disinfectant in pools, can dry out Black hair even further. So a swim cap that fits well is a vital protectant for their hair. This decision, of course, was quickly criticized by athletes and activists alike who worried that such a decision would discourage the participation of many younger, aspiring competitive swimmers with natural hair. But we know that representation matters. Young athletes who do not see swimmers that look like them may conclude that swimming is not an inclusive sport. So, what would you do? How do you imagine the Black Olympic swimmers felt upon notice of the International Swimming Federation's ruling? If this were a student in your school banned by the Illinois High School Athletic Association from using a cap that provides extra protection for their hair, how would you respond? How might we use the cultural proficiency continuum as a lens for us to further examine this issue? Was the International Swimming Federation culturally destructive? Did they see the difference and stomp it out? Were they culturally incapacitated in that they saw the difference and made it wrong? Were they culturally blind where they saw the difference but acted as if they did not? Were they culturally precompetent where they saw the difference but responded inadequately? Were they culturally competent? Did they see the difference and understand? Were they culturally proficient where they saw the difference and responded positively and affirmingly? How does noticing difference and making it wrong impact a student's social and emotional wellness? Doesn't every child deserve to be whole and well in the school setting and not culturally incapacitated? Culture is an identity marker. And remember, student identities are not yet fully formed. Being negatively reinforced for one's cultural membership can destroy one's sense of self. Principals should not forget that they have control over how far to the right their schools move along this continuum. Our work is to identify the places where, even if well-intentioned, our policies, practices, norms, individual or collective behavior diminish the cultural identities of our students. Recall the wisdom of Maya Angelou: when we know better, we do better. Are there any policies, practices, cultural norms or beliefs, or individual dispositions or behaviors and actions that would be rated anything other than culturally proficient in your school? If the answer is yes, we have to conclude that we have work to do. The only question is, where will your work begin, or where will your work continue? As we help students recover from learning loss due to the pandemic, giving teachers opportunities to learn about effective, equitable, and research-based strategies like cultural responsiveness, could not be more important. We love this quote from Dr. Ayala. Every student deserves to feel welcomed, included, and accepted at school. Students are more engaged when they see their cultures represented in what they learn. The culturally responsive standards for teachers and for teaching and leading for all educators in Illinois have recently been approved by the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules. We can refer to them as JCAR, and they'll soon be in effect. These new standards will require teacher and leader preparation programs to incorporate concepts such as implicit bias, historical inequities, student advocacy and representation, and social emotional development into their educator training coursework by October 2025. In 2018, the Council of Chief State School Officers partnered with 10 states, including Illinois, to engage in work to diversify the state's teacher pipeline and ensure that all teachers practice culturally responsive teaching. The standards were created over a 2-year period by a steering committee comprised of diverse stakeholders from institutions of higher ed, district and school level leadership, the Illinois State Board of Education, and the Illinois General Assembly. Notice Standard 1, reflect and gain a deeper understanding of themselves and how they impact others, and how well aligned it is with the CASEL standards and competencies that begin with self-awareness. We hope you're beginning to notice a relationship between social emotional learning and equity practice. In our zeal to act, it is possible to be misunderstood, or worse, to offend the very populations whose interests we may be seeking to advance. Culturally responsive pedagogy can often be oversimplified to include things like celebrations or superficial interpretations of a student's or community's cultural practice. Cultural difference, as we learned in that continuum, can also be pathologized or thought of as wrong. Cultural appropriation may be a new term for some of us. It's a new term for me. And it's the act of taking from a culture that is not one's own intellectual property, cultural expression, artifacts, history, and ways of knowledge, especially without understanding of and the deference to this culture. The authors of the article that is cited at the bottom of this slide contend that culturally responsive practice can be used as a smokescreen for good intentions, that culture can be used as a clever device to get students' attention, and that culturally responsive pedagogy can sometimes become a tool of assimilation. So while we want to encourage you to take on culturally responsive practices, we also want to caution you against doing some things that may actually be destructive and harmful and reduce the connection between teachers and students rather than deepen it. Culturally relevant pedagogy is only possible when teachers understand students' cultures and confront the bias that they hold about students and communities of color. The great Gloria Ladson-Billings was interviewed for the 74 recently, and she offered this guidance. Culturally relevant pedagogy includes academic excellence and academic striving, cultural competence, and critical consciousness. I'm going to talk about 4 priorities that rose from that interview. First of all, Dr. Billings encourages us to accept the fact that this really can't wait. If we wait until we know and understand everything about oppression and racism, we may never act. So do something thoughtfully. Secondly, she encourages us to plan with the why in mind. What's the cultural implication of teaching a particular topic? What is it that we want kids to do with it? And it's the fact that it's on a test is not a reason to actually address that topic. So think about the why. as you're planning. In your planning, connect lessons to current events, as we've tried to do here with the illustration of the competitive swimming controversy in the Tokyo Olympics. In a school setting, we might think about that the fact that if students are upset about policing tactics in particular communities, you might use the English class to help them write essays that they can send to a newspaper editorial board. Not sure how large of a problem this actually is? Why not use a mathematics class to identify a representative sample of 11th and 12th grade students who will be identified to respond to a survey exploring the topic? But avoid having kids do your advocacy work. Find out first what matters to them and start there. And finally, a fourth point that she made is the importance of teaching content, especially our nation's history, with accuracy. Embracing culturally responsive pedagogies challenges educators to critically reflect on the ways that they operate within institutionalized systems that perpetuate the academic marginalization and social disenfranchisement of students of color. And this task not only takes a significant amount of personal reflection, cultural humility, and emotional vulnerability for a predominantly white teaching force, but it challenges educators to dismantle social hierarchies, discourse, and power systems that have favored whiteness for centuries. This is especially challenging when over 86% of our nation's teachers are white. We contribute to oppression and racism when we look away or deny that racialized systems actually exist. So as a final connector to the overall theme of our work here on social emotional learning, think about this. There's nothing more liberating than self-knowledge. Equitable schools invite students to deeply explore their own identities through the content they select, the learning tasks they design, and the cultural elements they prioritize. In this next segment, Allison will talk with us about the importance of self-knowing, particularly the ability to recognize when we may be in need of self-care, so that in our desire to serve others, we do not extinguish ourselves in the process. Allison?
Thank you, Linda. In this section, we are going to address adult well-being, which is often misunderstood in many ways. While schools should prioritize students' mental health needs, evidence also supports the investing in the well-being of educators. As you can see on the next slide, this quote, "Remember to take care of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup," also harkens back to Dara's discussion earlier about putting on your own oxygen mask first. Teachers returning to classrooms in the aftermath of traumatic events and natural disasters, including the COVID pandemic, could suffer higher rates of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms that should not be left unaddressed. COVID is a stressor in addition to the daily stress of work and family life, stress that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. Remember that image from the beginning of our session of the teacher that was already overwhelmed with the papers in her basket to grade? We can't forget that all of these things interact. Humans decompress in different ways. Self-care can be misunderstood. Self-care is an individual activity, not a group activity. As you can see from the title, the word self is in self-care. Our work as principals and school leaders is to make time for teachers to explore how they decompress rather than to organize group activities. Many times we see principals creating an opportunity for a group walk or a group yoga class. Adjourning PD early to give teachers free time is also not helpful because teachers may not engage in self-care at that time. And the way that the different teachers decompress may not be available. Thinking of ways to provide time and space for these strategies is a crucial element of school leadership in our return to school setting. This summer, we saw a very public display example of the need for self-care with Simone Biles. Consider the danger she would have subjected herself if she had proceeded to compete while she was experiencing her own mental health trauma. This is not such a large leap from being a school teacher or a school leader. Don't forget, you expose your students to trauma if you are not ready to teach. We can use Simone's model as one for our teachers to help them recognize those triggers that may make them less ready for teaching, which can literally put their students in danger, just as Simone noticed that she was unable to compete. Our teachers need to learn to identify when they need self-care in order to be ready to teach. So how do we do that? An often misunderstood and co-opted term is self-care. Let's take a moment to define self-care so we are all on the same page. Simply put, it means to look after yourself in a healthy way. It doesn't necessarily mean a trip to the spa, as that might not be relaxing for everybody. This includes looking after yourself physically, mentally, and emotionally. It means doing big things like getting exercise and smaller ones like taking vitamins. Self-care also means that you continue to do the things that are important to you. Seeing friends and family for some people, taking regular vacations, and taking off the occasional day from work for others. When these things are neglected, it can cause problems, from depression to blood pressure spikes, weight gain, and other maladies. Those who have neglected self-care usually do so because they're stressed, they're burnt out, overworked, and have no time, or otherwise live crazy and hectic lives. This sounds very much like the life of almost every teacher. Do a self-reflection if you are a school leader. How do you make these 4 things transparent and accessible for all of your members of your school community? How do you streamline your schedule by doing 1 or 2 things well? How can you, as a school leader, model maintaining a self-care habit? When we recite the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning, can we take a deep breath before we launch into the school day? As Jennifer Gonzalez in the Cult of Pedagogy blog states, focus on the habit of the habit. Value the right actions over the right results. What things as a school leader might you want to strengthen this school year? Take a moment to read items 1 through 4 to make sure that you are self-assessing where you as a school leader can continue to grow in your ability to support teachers in self-care. On the next slide, we will look at some small steps that principals can take to promote individual well-being in the school setting. Integrating mindfulness practices in different ways. Making teachers and leaders sharing and modeling wellness visible to all, especially students. Instituting routines that build culture and provide space to cultivate adult wellness. Use the connections protocol to signal a break from activities that may precede a call to the collaborative workspace when you begin meetings with the instructional leadership team or other teacher teams. In our previous COVID models, we utilized the circle of concern and circle of influence exercise to focus our attention and workflow on the instructional leadership team and all teacher teams, so that we were not distracted by those things that often take up a lot of space and energy, but are actually not within our wheelhouse of solving. Insisting that the school be a psychologically safe space for students and adults will be incredibly important in this return to school setting and taking care of our adult well-being. Now I'm going to throw it back to Dara to further explore these ideas before we conclude.
While many resources have been highlighted throughout this presentation, we want to take the time to include just a few more. Illinois State Board of Education is organizing SEL hubs, which will be coming soon throughout the state of Illinois. Within these hubs, content developed by Lurie's Children's Hospital medical staff will be delivered by well-prepared trainers. It is important to note that Lurie's has many tools to support SEL. The Lurie Trauma Responsive School Implementation Assessment Tool may be used by schools to determine how trauma sensitive your school currently is, so that principals, in concert with instructional leadership teams, may begin to identify areas for improvement. The Illinois State Board of Education has additional resources that can be found on the Classroom in Action websites. Within these websites, a suite of resources addressing social emotional learning, anti-bias, and hate in school climate can be found. CASEL continues to be a thought leader in the area of social emotional learning. Their guide to school-wide social emotional learning is a resource worth investigating. The Leading Ed Partnerships team, in partnership with Bloomboard, has produced 4 Leaders for Equity micro-credentials based upon the Tennessee Leaders for Equity playbook. This portfolio of micro-credentials focuses upon leadership equity practice, may be added as badges to the Illinois professional license upon completion. They include exploring and deepening an equity mindset, applying a culturally responsive lens to a data cycle, guiding culturally responsive instructional practices, making cultural responsive personnel decisions, inducting teachers to retain culturally responsive staff. The content is appropriate for aspiring principals, current principals, and district level leaders. We recommend that teams enroll in the micro-credential sequence together so that they may benefit from naturally occurring or intentionally facilitated peer networking and support. Community Unit School District 308, Building Leadership Capacity, Empowering Students Toward Equity. Community Unit School District 308 is arguably one of the fastest growing school districts in Illinois. Their multi-year partnership with the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center has resulted in the refinement and implementation of the district's diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. The capacity building of several school leaders to engage in equity-focused school and classroom practices and increase student engagement. This partnership illustrates the importance of an intentional focus on capacity building of school leaders to engage in equity-focused school and classroom practices alongside the engagement, involvement, and empowerment of students, particularly those holding one or more non-dominant identities in district equity efforts to enact transformational change towards equity. We grounded ourselves in the recognition that SEL will be extremely important in the return to school because typical stressors present in adult daily life have been greatly compounded by COVID-19. During this presentation, we talked about the components of culture, climate, SEL integration across the school day, and emphasized the importance of professional learning to increase knowledge and skill in this area. We introduced the SEL priority standards, discussed the importance of self-care and the individualized nature of self-care. We have also talked about how leaders can model and reinforce SEL and personal wellness. We reminded participants of the 5 Essentials survey and introduced the school culture triage survey. We reviewed the culturally responsive standards for teaching and leading for all educators in Illinois and galvanized our equity convictions. And we provided an abundance of complementary resources. I now turn it over to Linda as she helps us bring this webinar to a closing.
Thank you so much, Dara, for reviewing those really useful resources for us and for providing the summary of this module. In a subsequent module, we hope to bring you the latest research on effective ways of extending time for learning. And that will be our module 4 in this recovery phase toolkit collection. So look for information about before or after school programming, Saturday school, and enrichment programming that can be offered during intersessions, such as breaks, observed holidays, and other non-student attendance days. And if summer school wasn't everything you hoped for this year, remember, ESSER 3 funding extends through 2024. There are 3 additional years of robust support possible on the horizon. I'd like to take just a moment to bring to your attention one of the wonderful resources that CASEL makes available for us. And as you can see, they encourage us to take the Together for SEL pledge. This powerful pledge could be recited by school staff in a symbolic act of solidarity around these issues, or it could be more carefully examined in teacher team meetings with a focus on developing one or more of these areas. So if you are looking for a way of bringing your community together around this topic, this might be a content source for you to consider. Finally, one of the last messages that we'd like to leave you with today comes from Sally Huss, who is an illustrator and a children's book author whose work I've come to appreciate. And I will take a moment to read this message. A happy child makes a happy home. A happy home makes a happy town. A happy town affects a city, which inspires a state. A happy state touches a nation. A happy nation helps create a happy world. So, being a happy child is the most important thing in the world. Can you think of anything more important than raising and educating happy, well-adjusted, resilient children? I can't either. We have come to the conclusion of Module 3, and we'd like to extend our best wishes as you work to create schools that are worthy of the children we serve. Thank you so much for your participation today.